Hello, and welcome to our video on integrated lessons. In this video, I will discuss how you can purposefully plan integrated lessons in order to observe for several different constructs within the context of what you're already teaching. So first, I'll begin with a brief overview of the 5 critical components of the formative assessment process. Then we'll be discussing purposeful planning to observe for several constructs in one lesson. And finally, I'll walk you through the formative assessment process using a sample lesson. There are a couple of different resources you might want to have on hand for this video. The first is our KEA at a glance document, which shows the skill steps for all the different constructs in one place. The next document is our planning document, which takes you through the 5 critical components, and this is what I'll be using to talk through them later. You may want to follow along or take notes. So let's talk about the 5 critical components of the formative assessment process. The 5 critical components are not linear, but spiral in nature. So each component leads on to the next. I'm going to dive in today with eliciting evidence of learning because I'm thinking about the beginning of the year. I'm getting a new group of students that I want to gather information about. So in eliciting evidence, teachers gather evidence in multiple ways so that students have teacher-initiated and child-initiated opportunities to show what they can say, do, make, and write. Evidence is then interpreted by locating students' current learning statuses along the construct progressions. Teachers provide descriptive feedback based upon which criteria for success have been met and which have not been met, and they make adjustments to instruction based upon students' current learning statuses. Then, learning targets are selected using students' current learning status, which is the next step along the construct progression, to meet individual needs. Finally, performance descriptors are used to develop criteria for success for learning targets. Teachers model strategies to demonstrate the criteria for success for students. So when we talk about purposeful planning, this is what we mean. I can start by asking, what am I teaching tomorrow or next week? Virgil and Owen Stick Together by Paulette Bogan is a story I would typically read in the beginning of the year to my students. It's a story about 2 good friends who go through a tough patch and ultimately build their friendship. I like this story for the beginning of the year because it provides a context in which students can identify and discuss the emotions of the characters, and I can make connections to our classroom community and what it means to be a friend. But you don't need to use this book to observe for the constructs we'll be discussing today. You can choose any book you like. Choose your favorite read aloud. Choose something you're already planning to teach, and then purposefully plan for how you can incorporate the construct progressions into your learning opportunities. So, which constructs will I plan to observe during this read aloud lesson? And how will I plan to elicit evidence of learning? I can observe for following directions as I call students to the circle for read aloud using 2-step directions. If I provide directions to small groups at a time, I can manage the students' movement, as I normally do, from learning stations to the reading circle, while still being able to take notes. I can also provide a visual cue and make a note on my observation grid for those students who need it. So I might say, for example, I'd like the trapezoid table to come to the carpet. When you get there, make a circle, sitting crisscross applesauce. Or when I notice one of my students, Megan, doesn't follow directions, I might want to provide a visual cue. So I approach her and I point to the carpet for her while reminding her of the directions. I can also observe for emotional literacy. I can do this by pre-planning intentional prompts throughout the story that focus on identifying what Virgil and Owen are feeling and asking students to identify these emotions. These are the types of questions I would be asking anyway when I teach this story. So now I'm just prompting my students a little more intentionally, and I'm asking students to show me in a way that I can record their responses quickly so I can gather that evidence. So I might say, how do you think Owen feels when Virgil finishes writing his name for him? Draw a quick face on your whiteboard to show me how Owen feels. Or I might ask, how do you think Owen feels when he roars? How do you think Virgil feels when Owen roars at him? Now show me with your face how you think they feel. Finally, I can observe for grip and manipulation. So if I've taught my students to use their personal whiteboards or their personal clipboards, this is a great opportunity for me to observe for grip and manipulation. I could do this by choosing to take a few quick pictures here and there to analyze the evidence later, and I can provide scaffolding in the moment as needed. So for example, I might say, Trayshawn, show me how we hold a marker in kindergarten. Look how I'm doing it. Now you try. Or I might say, I can see Shahid is holding his marker with his thumb and pointer finger, just like me, see? Great job, Shahid. Who else can hold your marker the way we've practiced? So now that we've thought about which constructs we're going to observe for and how we elicit evidence, let's think about how will I interpret the evidence. You interpret evidence by using your observations and applying them to the construct progressions so that you can choose a current learning status for your student at a given time. So let's go back to Megan. Let's say she remains in her seat after I give directions to go to the carpet. So I approach her and I give her a visual cue. I point to the carpet and I repeat, Megan, it's time to sit on the carpet. And after getting that cue and reminder, she follows directions. So I want you to take a moment using your at a glance document and jot down or speak with a partner about where you think Megan's current learning status should be on the construct. I've placed Megan's current learning status as D. When given visual cues, she accurately follows an oral one-step direction that includes positional words, in this case, on, for on the carpet. I notice here too that I could use the construct progression to look at the next step, and the next step happens to be exactly the same, except for it's without visual cues that the student is able to do this. So I can make a mental note at the time, or I can even interject right at the time to have a small conversation with Megan saying, I can tell that lately you really need me to come and point you to the carpet after I give directions. I want you to try next time to listen carefully to directions the first time so that you don't need the teacher to come over and tell you. Let's look at emotional literacy. Let's say I ask, how do you think Virgil feels when Owen roars? And Valentina correctly labels the emotion by saying, I think he feels shocked. Take a moment to jot down or speak with a partner about where you think Valentina's current learning status should be. I've placed Valentina's current learning status as F, labels higher order emotions such as confused, worried, or surprised in self and others. So shocked definitely qualifies as a higher order emotion, and it's a great vocabulary word for kindergarten. And I can use this information on the construct progression to look at the next step, and that helps me think about where I can go next with Valentina. Let's do one more. So let's think about grip and manipulation. Let's say I notice Trayshawn is only rarely using his whole arm to manipulate the marker as he writes. He's got pretty good wrist control and pretty good fine motor control. So take a moment to look at your at-a-glance document and decide where you think Trayshawn's current learning status should be. I've assigned Trayshawn's current learning status as E. Hand movements are primarily controlled by actions from the wrist and fingers. So In this way, we can interpret the evidence using the information on the construct progressions, and the construct progressions help us think about what comes next for our students. It's important to note that this process isn't about assigning a label to a student. The current learning status is dynamic, and it's just a tool for you as a teacher to think about what's next for a particular student or a group of students. So, how will I adapt and respond to students' learning needs? Paying close attention to specific things gives me an opportunity to adapt my instruction and better meet my students' needs using the skills along the construct progressions. So here I need to think about, first, planning specific probes and questions so that I can extend the discussion in my classroom. I need to think about providing descriptive feedback in the moment, and I need to be prepared to provide responses and modeling or scaffolding to meet students' needs. So in this way, I can think about probes and questions to use during the read aloud that will extend the discussion and deepen understanding about emotional literacy. I can immediately provide visual cues in the moment who need them for following directions, like I did with Megan. I can model and describe emotions throughout the story for students who need this scaffold, and I could use this as an example for later teaching as well, so I can remember back to our experience with Virgil and Owen and say, remember how Virgil was feeling when that happened? I can also provide immediate descriptive feedback and modeling for grip and manipulation as students are writing with their whiteboards. So how will I select learning targets as a result of the students' current learning statuses? So let's say I've used an observation grid, such as this one, in order to record the evidence I gathered on a given day when I taught the lesson. I've done this by jotting down the date where I observed students to have a particular learning status. So let's say I look at this observation grid and I see that Matea and Isaac are falling under the category of B, responding non-verbally to simple requests in a variety of ways. So I can use this information to think about how I can grab Matea and Isaac in a small group in my next lesson with them so that I can cater my instruction directly to them and think about how I can take them to the next step, learning target C. So the North Carolina K-3 formative assessment process online platform has this really cool function where you can get something called a class profile report. And what this report is a breakdown of where each of your students is as far as current learning status within a given construct. But what it does for you is it groups your kids for you, so you can take a look and see where your small groups are, and you can think about where you want to take them next. So looking at my class profile report, I can see, for example, that I have a small group that has a current learning status of D. So I can think about what I want to do with them next, and I decide to do a follow-up lesson with them in a small group, during which I can model identifying feelings, I can be explicit about how I determine the feelings of the characters, and I can better respond to the students' needs because I'm in a small group setting. So this actually leads me to the final critical component that I'll be talking about today, developing criteria for success. So using what I learned during the observations and from the class profile report, I can demonstrate criteria for success for individual students and small groups based upon their learning targets. So thinking about that group that had the learning status D and thinking about where I want to take them next, I decide to read this book called When Sophie Gets Angry by Molly Bang. During this lesson, I can think aloud about how Sophie's features and actions demonstrate her feelings. So I might say, oh wow, I can see here that Sophie's face is very red. She's yelling a big yell. That tells me she's feeling very angry. I can also model making text-to-self connections, sharing a simple story of a time when I was so angry that I cried, modeling facial expressions for anger and sadness, and explicitly pointing them out for students. So in this way, I could use the information that I had to generate a new lesson and to think about how I can develop and demonstrate criteria for success for my students. So that concludes our illustration of using the 5 critical components of the formative assessment process in order to purposefully plan to observe for constructs and adapt instruction accordingly to meet the needs of individual students. Please explore these additional resources for more helpful information and tools to support implementation of the formative assessment process.